We'll talk a little bit about the giveaway and then go to marketing attribution from there, which is, of course, what you are all here today for. So, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Cameron Collins. I am the community manager with Sprocketeer. I am also a revenue operations strategist with Rev Partners. So, I love RevOps. I love HubSpot. I live and breathe this stuff. I've got my co host, Mark Lerner, director of growth marketing at Deal Hub, and our esteemed guest today, Chris Singlemann. Chris, I'll let you tell everyone a little bit about yourself, and then we'll dive into all the fun things everyone wants to hear about.
Yeah, right on. Thank you for having me on the show. Super excited to be here. My name is Chris. I am a demand generation marketer at Prelude Security. I empathize when you're talking about living and breathing HubSpot, as I have done that for most of my marketing career. I had the opportunity to work at a HubSpot agency and then continue to work at HubSpot Orgs, which has been a lot of fun for me. And really love diving into the operations of it all. Love the fact there's no one size fits all. Just get to be creative. At the end of the day, I hate puzzles in real life, but I love operational puzzles. So that's why I keep gravitating towards stuff like this.
I'm so excited that we're going to be talking about really all the different themes that we have here today. Before we dive into marketing attribution, which I know is what everyone really wants to hear about, I'm going to be sharing a little thing that I made. So we have a workflow. We're going to be doing this in real time in the best way that I can imagine we do here in a HubSpot themed podcast. So for those who are listening, just to describe what we have on the screen here, it is a workflow that is currently timed. I set the enrollment for 45 minutes. It's been ticking away for a few minutes now, but in 38 minutes, we're going to find out who won the Sprocket Pod swag. If you are currently tuned into the show, we do have branches here for everyone who's been participating all week. However, it is not too late. If you are listening to the show, drop comments, let us know. Just add to the discussion throughout the conversation today, and your name can be added into the workflow branch. And at the end, when the timer runs out, this is going to pick the winner of the Sprocket Pod swag giveaway. We'll be giving away a baseball cap, and just, I'm excited to be doing a little giveaway here. That is the setup.
Use of a random split that I've seen so far. So already off to a great start.
Yeah, it was inspired. I remember for Inbound last year, I think it was the guys at Arrows it was like, should I get a beer? And then it was a workflow and all routes led back to yes. So this is my creative way of us giving away some swag. It truly will be random based on this workflow. I did test to make sure that it was going to be random. So I ran it a few times and I could show y'all here, although we'll have a little bit of trust, but the drop down property will pick one of the names based on the branch. So if you want your name added to the branch, contribute to the conversation and let us know your thoughts as we're talking about marketing attribution today. Enough of that, though. Let's talk marketing. First and foremost, Chris, I know that there are probably going to be, I know there's people who have strong opinions when it comes to marketing attribution. And this is one of those things where there are many right ways to do it, but there's also a lot of things that you can do poorly when it comes to setting up how you track marketing for a company. I know today is going to be a little bit of a show and tell. I want to just turn the floor over to you to lay the framework and talk about your thoughts on setting up marketing attribution and best practices.
Absolutely. I think one of the coolest things about what we're going to go through today is that I recently joined Prelude, which is a great cybersecurity company if you're ever in the market. But I recently joined Prelude and it was a blank slate when it came to attribution and operations, which is like a marketing operation person's dream. You get to completely start from scratch, really lay the foundation of what it's going to look like. And having come from organizations where I inherited pieces of what we were deciding to set as primary campaign source, what defines an MQL, what defines a lead, where is this lead coming from? Is it demand capture? Is it demand generation? There's a lot of variables that you have to consider. So to me, it was very exciting to enter a scenario where you have to consider all of those elements from scratch and map out, like, how is this truly going to scale? I think one of the most challenging elements of marketing operations is determining, I have the solution for the here and now, but is the solution going to work in 5, 6, 12 months when the business is different, the product is different, the market is different? And so it was very much a challenge for me coming in where it was like, I have a ton of ideas and I have a ton of ideas from people I follow on LinkedIn, people in the marketplace who are telling me this is the best way to do it. But is it the best way for my organization? And is it the best for us right now? I think like one of the most difficult things is also knowing when to not inject process into it. So one of the pieces that we really set out to do when we started this process was understand, like, what do we need here and now to track the success of our marketing efforts and evaluate where we're going to place our budget, and what are we going to think to scale to in the future. And the great piece was we did like half of the things we thought we were going to scale to because the business changes and the market changes. And we came up with the object that we're going to run through today, which I think is really exciting.
I think one of the coolest things when it comes to any company applying a model that suits them is, again, if we think about just where does anybody start, the most basic first step is opening the dialogue on, is the way that we're doing this today even the best route that we should be taking? As a strategist with Rev Partners, I work with so many different companies of all different sizes and setups. And oftentimes, when it comes to attribution, as any company probably has it today, it was something that was piecemealed together based on what HubSpot could do 6 months ago, a year ago plus. And I think that what's really exciting about the setup that you're going to be presenting is it really brings a solution that suits you based on what HubSpot can do today. Because HubSpot has changed a lot. And for anybody who's listening, if you haven't evaluated how your marketing attribution is set up within the past 3 months, then that's something that you definitely want to be going back and just having that conversation with your leadership team or your marketing team ASAP. And with that in mind, I want you to go ahead and share what you've built. But as you're getting that pulled up and as we're breaking down your solution for marketing attribution, I'm keen to hear your thoughts on self reported attribution. 'Cause I know that we had a few people commenting on a few of my posts throughout this week that have very strong opinions, some of which I agree with, some of which I disagree with. But what are your thoughts, Chris, when it comes to allowing users to self report where a contact has come from?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great place for us to get started as well, because that was ultimately what, when I entered Prelude, that was the foundational element. We had people telling us where they came from, and we were manually assigning kind of a concept of original source based on that. What I think is really important to note about self-source attribution is that, and I think I'm forgetting the name of the brand, but someone speaks to it very well with this concept like software based and there's self reported. And then you can marry those two pieces to really get a clear picture of where your leads are coming from. Because the concept that leads are all coming from the same place at the same time isn't really the way the buyer's journey is working today. They might hear about your brand 6 months prior on a podcast and then click on a Google ad when they start to search you. So the moment of demand generation is very different than the moment of demand capture. And we want to think about the fact that self-reported attribution is actually a really great way to navigate that, because we can start to hear like, where did you first hear about us? How did we first enter your space in the buying journey? And then we can use the software side of things to start figuring out what was the second touch, what was the actual like most recent piece that got them to us to actually fill out a form and book a demo. But 6 months ago, it was this podcast. We're hearing that from them. The software is telling us that capture happened because of Google Ads. And it's a mechanism of actually finding multiple ways to report on that.
Chris, do you have a strong opinion, and this is probably opening a can of worms here, as to the first touch, last touch, middle touch conundrum? This has been going on as long as I can remember in terms of how people attribute and what model they use.
So I think that's probably the biggest difference between what we've deployed here, which is the sense that we're not super interested in what was the middle touch and what drove the contact creation and what do this. Like, we ungate our assets, so we're ultimately like, we're more of an awareness level play where we're putting stuff out into the market, and you might hear about us through multiple mechanisms, and then you're going to come through and convert on a demo. So in some cases, the last touch is always a demo request, and it's always that form fill. It might be coming from a LinkedIn ad or whatever, but the real first touch happened months ago on a piece of content that we put out on LinkedIn, and you download the document ad for it. So I think the most important element is like looking at your activities in a spectrum. You're not going to always see that this was the most influential piece of creating a deal because your software is telling you that. Ultimately, the individual is going to be able to tell you like what convinced them to buy at the end of the day. And because of that, when we're putting so much content out into the market, it's, in my opinion, much better to look at it from a broad spectrum of like, where is the influence happening across the board? How many touches did we get? I don't necessarily care too much right now at our scale which one is doing what at a given time. Did our content get touches is ultimately the biggest piece that I'm looking at.
And so let's bridge the gap here because there's two things that we need to talk about. One is you have first touch, last touch. And I think that there's value to knowing what was the first touch, what was last touch, what was everything in between, and building systems for tracking all that are important. in my opinion, it's less about getting hung up as a business on should we use first touch, should we use last touch, because every business is going to be different. Some for the baseline reporting that's important to them may lean into one or the other. But I think the most important thing is defining and deciding which of the two you're potentially going with, for example, and then consistently leaning into that. So, for example, if you're building reporting that relies on first touch, making sure that all of your reports follow that. Same thing with last touch. And then from there, you can expand, right? 'Cause I've seen a lot of companies that get stuck in this analysis paralysis where they don't know if they want to use first touch reporting. They don't know if they want to use last touch reporting. They have a whole bunch of reports with both, but it doesn't really tell them anything because there's no consistency and they just haven't even made a decision on what's really important to them.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I'll preface with one of the pieces that we've deployed is this concept of our lead source is the first touch and our primary campaign source is the last touch before you've decided to request a demo. We're looking at both. We're advocating for budget. Our primary campaign source is the concept of like where are we going to allocate the most dollars, and we're mapping that concept of okay, these 5 events drove X amount of pipeline, and these 5 ad campaigns drove X amount of pipeline. And now we can say, based on the return on investment in those, we're going to put more dollars into events. We're going to put more dollars into paid, whatever it is. And we have those channels really tight. It's events, paid campaigns, awareness level, and sponsorships, influencers, and things of that nature. And that's where we're going to leadership and saying we want X more dollars in sponsorships because we're seeing this level of revenue coming from those activities. On the marketing side, we get to take that a level deeper. And I'll actually jump in here and present. So this is what I'm talking about when I'm thinking about like our budget channels, and just make sure you can see my screen here. We've got our budget channel of paid media, sponsorships, events, and awareness, and our lead sources, which are those first touch, which is a combination of software and self-declared, which I'll show in a minute, is what's ultimately pointing up to those things and saying, this person came from a Google ad, so their budget channel is paid media. This person came from referral, word of mouth, they are on the awareness level. And on the marketing team, we're looking at lead source and saying, okay, underneath sponsorships, we got this many leads from X sponsor, this many leads from X sponsor. Our executives aren't as invested in that. They don't need to necessarily know that much. It's important for the marketing team to understand where our first touches are coming from. The last touches is the combination of what ultimately drove them to book a demo. And that's where we might invest more dollars. And then when we are actually deciding what gets the dollars within those channels, that's when we start to look at that first touch and the lead source. Does that make sense?
So what you have is, I think, really awesome because it's very similar to something that I'm an advocate for, where you take these sources and then you bucket them. And I want to go back a few steps to something that we were talking about toward the beginning of our conversation, which is that notion of self-reported attribution. So there's 2 types of self-reporting. One is the user who, through a form on the website, says this is where I found you, or they enter their details. But the other is, and I don't know if maybe we need to rename it from self-reported attribution to sales reporting attribution, but it's letting the creator of the record or letting the sales rep potentially be the one who adds in, this is how I found the contact, or this is the source of the contact. And
Yeah.
anyone who's listening is going to probably be rolling their eyes right now and groaning a little bit, because sales reps aren't always known for their data hygiene prowess. And so, Mark, Chris, I want to hear from you guys with your thoughts on allowing and even potentially encouraging sales reps to be a part of that data entry process, or is that something that we should be removing probably as much as we could?
Chris, do you want to take this one first, or should I take it?
Yeah. So personally, I'm a huge advocate of, first of all, like revenue operations is that alignment between marketing and sales. And the more that we can collaborate on that, yes, you will have scenarios where your CRM data is a little bit messy. But one thing that I think, and I mentioned earlier, is that you don't always have to inject process into a scenario. Like sometimes better operations is knowing when not to, because it makes it easier for your sales reps to get involved in that process. We've learned a ton about where our leads are coming from, because on that first call, they're talking to that rep and they said they heard about us through a LinkedIn ad, and then HubSpot captured that they came through that ad. And then they say, actually, my old boss used to use your product. That to me is much more valuable than knowing that they were talking and like came through a LinkedIn app. So I want to find that person and turn them into an evangelist. So like those conversations are super valuable, and providing a mechanism for sales reps to provide that insight back is, in my opinion, really valuable.
Yeah, I think that having a sales rep put that in based on the conversation and that conversation being documented is one thing, but having it the source of something on a sales rep to input on a regular basis is probably a bug rather than a feature. It's like a step on the way, but not the ideal state. The ideal state is to have it automated in some way, except when it's self-reported by the lead themselves. The larger the company, the more different orgs within the company. A lot of times they have misaligned incentives as to attribution, and that opens it up for people injecting bias into it, and it's just not great, and that's inevitable to happen, and that's why you need a unbiased third party, ideally some sort of computer where it's like a real source of truth that has no skin in the game. And so I think that's the ideal state, but just having people willy-nilly input stuff like that is going to, in the long run, especially as you grow, is going to lead to some bad outcomes.
Something that I agree that in my opinion, we do want to automate as much as we can. It doesn't mean necessarily taking away the ability for a sales rep to input that information, but I think that there does need to be a check and balance for reviewing it. And so an example would be you have reporting that says, okay, of these buckets, for example, you have paid media, but then if the sales rep goes in and has a source that is self-reported as a referral, having a report that shows, hey, this is a paid media contact with a self-reported attribute that shows like sales generated referral. And so it's not necessarily that I would say it's bad to allow a sales rep to enter that information, but I think that you do need a way to know where there's not even misalignment, but just different pieces of data that are saying different things. Because even if you have, for example, a digital source that's going to say, oh, they downloaded the form as the first touch, but then in reality, the actual first touch was a phone call that wasn't logged or something a little less tangible, you do need a way to capture that.
Yeah, and it depends on your sales motion as well. We're fairly inbound, like at the moment. Like it's still very early stage, so we're split. There's outbound, there's referral, there's inbound, but we're still in the greater scheme of things, pretty led by inbound and referral. So we're able to scale with that context coming from the sales team because there's less of that sales reported going on. But Mark, I think your point is super accurate, and it's something that you can build over time.
Something that I would love to dig into. So we have here that is a contact triggered workflow, unless
Mm-hmm.
I'm missing it, but I believe it is contact triggered. And when it comes to taking this full scale,
Yeah.
you've got your contacts that can have their original sources, their lead sources. These can be self reported, they can be automated, right? And then you have ultimately all of these actual sources that go into buckets, so paid media, sponsorships, events. The answer is probably straightforward and intuitive, but just for everyone listening, how do you get this information then onto the deal?
Sure. That is a pretty simple workflow where we mirror the properties on the deal record of lead source and then budget channel. And there's a workflow that copies the properties from the contact source to the deal. And that ultimately comes from whichever contact is responsible for being the deal created. But I think to expand on your question is in this workflow, which is our like actual lead source creation, which is where that software information and the self-declared information start to get merged. So it goes through a number of cycles. And we've come to this concept of like, where are the most important triggers for our lead source? Like, where are they actually coming from? And it comes down to, we're going to check their self-source information. We're going to check our paid integrations. We're going to check UTM sources that we have on the record. And if we can't find any of those, then it becomes a manual exercise. And this workflow does answer for many of those pieces. So one of the operations that I undertook when I first joined was like understanding like what are the primary ways that people are declaring of finding us. So what I started to do is I pulled the last 200 submissions on a form that we had all those properties for that were previously being manually updated, and said, what are the common keywords? And I mapped those keywords to what the lead source would be in HubSpot. And then we just created this branch where, based on keywords in that how did you hear about us form, we're starting to map towards those lead source categories. And then we provide additional checks. So for instance, LinkedIn, Reddit, Twitter, social, or social media, we might run through the integration in HubSpot to check whether or not they have a touch from the LinkedIn integration or the Google Ads integration to see if it's actually a paid versus an organic touch. And once we start to bucket those things, if there are new keywords that appear in our how you heard about us field, operations team gets alerted and starts to update this workflow. So this is a regularly updated piece where we're trying to merge that concept of software and self-declared source. And we look at, there are scenarios where this isn't always perfect and it's a constantly iterated thing where we want to be able to check, like, okay, this person said they heard about us through word of mouth, but we have a Google Ads touch from 6 months ago. What's the right scenario here? And as we scale, that's something that we start to automate more and more of. But where we're at currently with the volume that we have, we can handle that. Again, we don't want to inject process everywhere. We want to be able to look at these things pretty regularly. And that has been like a big learning moment for me. I came in, I'm going to fix everything. But the reality is that's not always going to happen. You have to let the scenario play out and the market tell you and your leads tell you where they're coming from and what the given scenario is. It's like almost a challenge for an operations person to not want to go in and do the thing and write the workflow. But I think as we're scaling, there's just as much manual as there is automated, with the goal to automate as much as possible by learning from the findings from our submissions, from what people are telling us in those sales conversations.
So I want to take this all the way to the top of the funnel, or some might even say it's before the funnel officially starts. But we've been talking about first touch, last touch reporting. We have a workflow that takes all of the original sources along with any type of self-reporting info that's being put in or manual entry, and it logs these details at the contact level. And then there's the workflow that copies it from the contact to the deal, which, by the way, for all of our HubSpot admin listening, you probably have pieced together. This means that you do need to define the whole first touch, last touch component, because if you're going to take that acquisition channel and put it as the source of truth on the deal, then you want to determine, is it going to be based on the first contact associated to the deal, the last contact associated to the deal, or am I logging everything and then reporting on any number of those combinations?
And the reality is that can change. So I want to preface just like slightly, like our lead source is that first touch. Oftentimes that is also the last touch before they become an MQL. Like they are, again, we ungate things, so they're coming straight to demo. And occasionally, like the first time they heard about us was the ad that they clicked. And we don't have that differentiation between first and last touch. But there are plenty of scenarios where that's not the case. We see that a lot with events, which is actually why we built the object that I'm going to show today, where they heard about us or clicked on an ad and they might have engaged previously. And then we reconnect with them and hold a meeting with them at an event. And that's what ultimately gets them to book a demo. So we have that scenario where we have the first touch, we know where they originally came from, but the last touch that ultimately drove them to a demo might be different. And we are calling that our primary campaign source, where we're like, the revenue will be allocated to, because it is the thing that drove them to demo. But we on the marketing team understand the first touch to be where we might want to focus more of our initial generation and demand efforts.
Mark, I'm keen to hear your thoughts, and then Chris, you as well. If we try to measure the immeasurable, which is the dark funnel, and Chris, you've mentioned LinkedIn a few times in downloads, but what's your take when it comes to the dark funnel playing a role, being able to track as much as we can?
I've spent a lot of time on this internally recently over the last year. I think, first of all, it's a great name, whoever branded it. Sounds so badass. Second of all, I don't think anything is untrackable, unattributable. There are a lot of blockers in the way, especially that you were talking about third-party platforms, LinkedIn, or in various online forums and groups that make it very difficult. But nothing is impossible, and so there's that. But it is very true that a lot of the attribution actually happens in those places. A lot of times I'll read the Gong script or overview of a sales call. And in it, they'll say, oh, we heard about you because we had a conversation with this person, or my boss was in a Slack community who heard about it from that person. So it's very hard to capture those. But that, to me, that's just a problem that hasn't been solved yet. And I think it will be. And whoever does is going to make a lot of money. But it's a problem I'm actually working to solve internally in various ways. And it's been a lot of fun and exciting.
I think you're right. Whoever does figure it out will make a lot of money. I think there are a lot of companies who claim that they do. There's the concept of intent signals. There's social listening tools and things of that nature. My personal thought is it's only going to get harder. I don't know if it'll get easier. I think the person who just dropped in the chat with the kind of cookieless future concept, data privacy, and the concept of, just a couple months ago, Chrome was removing cookies. Now they've walked that back. How's that going to change things? I only think it's going to get harder. And I think as marketers, we can only work with the information that we're provided and the information that you go out and source. And the best marketers are ones that are looking at every possible data point that they can and trying to make the educated hypotheses. Like, you're not going to be right every time. And the reality is there is so much data out there that we're not already leveraging that there's so much more. Like, we have great strides that we can continue to make. Like, we're a small team. Are we ready for intent signals? Probably not. Are we ready to spend on intent signals? Probably not. So there's ways that you can graduate to those things and get even further. It's pulling in those relevant data points. Okay, our social media referral leads popped off this month. What happened on LinkedIn? What happened on Twitter? It's knowing where to go and look. And ultimately, that is like where I think the really great marketers separate themselves, knowing where to look, asking the right questions. And if the data doesn't exist, that's when you start to ask, like, how do we get more visibility and clarity into this? Like, I think sometimes it can be really tempting to just go and get as much data as possible, but is it the right places that you should be looking? So those first two qualifiers is it the right place to look, and do you have the right questions to ask? I think are important things to wonder and think about first before you start to solve for that dark funnel.
Yeah.
And the dark funnel is, of course, challenging inherently by nature because of an inability to track certain things that are happening outside of your purview. That's just the nature of it. I think that this is where having the self reporting really becomes helpful because not only now do you have the ability to just ask the person, whether that is through their own mechanism that they enter details into a form, or if it's the sales rep who says, well, I had a conversation with someone and here's my first touch with them. But it does, having those conversations are just really a necessary part of the marketing and sales process. And so if you're not asking your customers at some point, like, how did you hear about us? Then you're absolutely missing out because they may say, oh, I've been following you on LinkedIn for the past 12 months and now was just the right time to download the form.
Yep.
But if the first time that you're getting data is when they submit the form, then you don't know that they've been following you for the past 12 months. You have to make sure that you're just having that dialogue and incorporating it as a part of your really marketing, sales, or service part of your process, right? Somebody at some point needs to be asking about this.
Yeah. And it's so easy to look at what HubSpot spits out and says, well, they came from Google Ads. We have got to put more money into Google Ads. But that's a misattribution of like where that impact or that demand generation might have actually come from. And I think like one of the reasons we structured it this way is that it's because it's also very easy for people who are outside the marketing organization to look and see Google Ads or so our paid media is really killing it. But we can go back and say, like, actually, our referral traffic is what's driving a lot of this. And then they happen to be looking at us and they decide to click on an ad. And so we wanted to structure it in such a way where it was really easy for the marketing team to go back to external stakeholders and say, these are the 4 buckets that we prioritize from our budgeting. Events is really driving stuff. Awareness is really driving stuff. And then we get to take it a layer deeper when we're like deciding the activities in those areas. What are the sources that we're going to go off in those areas and start to really put our dollars toward?
I'm really curious to hear about the output of all of this, which is the reporting, because marketing attribution, being able to log it is the first half to all of this, but then being able to report on it is really a whole nother thing entirely. And
Sure.
every company is going to have their own reports and attribution models. And all of this is really probably before we even start to talk about J modeling and all the different types of actual data models. But what are some reports or some ways that you would then look at this data that probably any company should start to just even look at? how they
Yeah.
bucket their sources?
So I think it's important to characterize that we kind of embrace this in a very like two-step approach. Like when I first joined, it was very much where are the leads coming from? Why? How are people hearing about us? And what are the sources that are actually driving demand for Prelude? And it was first touch. How'd you hear about us? How did we get in touch with you? And it was here are MQLs by lead source week over week. Here are the MQLs by budget channel so that we could see, oh, awareness is really our main driver right now, or paid media really jumped up this month. And it was very much our first touch. How did you hear about us? As we started to put more out into market and really continue to scale the go-to-market efforts, it was a conversation of we're getting multiple touches. The way that somebody hears about us first is not always going to be the time that they decide to book a demo. We need a way to track the influence that we are having, especially if like we're touching the same MQL multiple times before they book a meeting. So we had our reports with the kind of a week over week look, a month over month look, so we could start to see which channels are the ones that are driving success for us on a regular basis. And then it became a conversation of how do we start to evaluate like what are the tried and true campaigns that are driving impact for us. And this largely came as a result of we were doing more event presence, and there is the marketing events object in HubSpot. If you're not using a third-party tool, it can be a little bit difficult, especially like we were finding it's like uploading additional lists. We wanted to be able to evaluate, similar to our conversation with the dark funnel, who did we actually talk to? Who was just a booth visit? How much engagement did we get with them? Did they come to an ancillary event? And start to track like the total impact of that event. So we went out and we have myself, my director, and several other execs who are going off and coming from like Salesforce shops to discuss wanting Salesforce campaign reporting in HubSpot. But having been a HubSpot user like for a very long time and then getting a touch of Salesforce, I was like, campaign reporting in Salesforce is very nice. It's a very easy way to look at a high level. What impact did it have and what's it touching? And so what we set out to do is recreate the Salesforce campaign experience to create regular reports around the efforts that we were putting into market. And I spoke to a handful of colleagues in the space, Pat Buono, Wyatt Borchetta-Platt, both wonderful revenue operations strategists, if you don't already know them, to get a sense of like how this was previously built in the past. And I went through a lot of case studies with how people who were migrating from Salesforce to HubSpot recreated that Salesforce campaign reporting functionality in HubSpot. And a lot of it came down to creating multiple objects. You needed to have a campaign members, you needed to have a campaigns, and that was ultimately too complex for our scale. It wasn't something that we needed to go crazy for. We just needed a really quick and clean way to demonstrate here's the impact of this particular effort that we're having. Here's the impact of this event. So we created the go-to-market campaign custom object, and effectively it functions almost entirely with object associations, which received a wonderful boon this week with the beta that I'm sure everyone has heard about of now being able to manage associations and HubSpot workflows out of the box. Though massive shout out to Associate, which is a wonderful third-party tool that helped us get this off the ground initially. But essentially how it functions is we associate records with the campaign in question when they've been touched by that campaign. So we're running conversation ads. This is all dummy data, but we're running conversation ads. You converted on it from the interaction comes from the integration. You're associated with it as responded. And we start to see, okay, 7 people have interacted with this campaign and have some sort of touch from it. If it is the last thing you did before you MQL'd, it is your primary campaign source, and that's set and stamped on the contact record. I'll show some of the workflows that we use to build that. And then if it is the last touch, your deal is created and it's marked as sourced. And so we have an influenced pipeline of 200K. And then if that closes, it's 200K of sourced revenue. But let's say I'm Chris and I already MQL'd and I saw this ad and I clicked on it and I was like, oh, now this is my second touch. I'm added to this campaign as an influenced contact. And so I have the ability to see that not only has this created 200K in revenue, it's also influenced 400K because Keith touched this ad, but he was already in our active opportunity. And so we can start to see that spread of your first touch. This is where the actual lead came from. Here's the last touch of what drove them to MQL, but they also touched these 3 other campaigns. So we're able to evaluate the performance of the efforts that we're putting out to market in a pretty quick way.
How do you decide what to use as for attribution? For example, every blog post you put out, does it have something like this that you can have influenced revenue? I know that their entire company is based on this, but I've been places where that was a request. Can you show us attribution of revenue to this piece of content?
Yeah, so it's very still a small organization. So I'll talk a little bit about how we want to scale this. Right now, we create it for things that we're like putting dollars behind. We go to an event, we're creating a campaign for that event. We are putting a conversation ad into market, we're going to create a campaign around that. What we would also like to do is, as we roll out holistic content campaigns, is start to take advantage of HubSpot's innate functionality there, where we can associate the blog posts with those content campaigns, the existing object in HubSpot, and then associate those content campaigns with these objects that we're creating. Differentiate behind these are the things that we were putting money behind, and this is the overarching concept. So if we want to talk about detection and response engineering as a concept, we're going to associate all of our content, these 4 blog posts, this guide, this LinkedIn document ad. This conversation ad is speaking to that messaging. So we're going to associate that content campaign with this. So that is like the current thought process, where if we're putting dollars behind it, it gets a campaign. So we track the in and out of those efforts.
And just to reiterate, this is a custom object.
Yes. So this is a custom object where it uses just a finite number of fields for number of members, opportunities, influenced, sourced pipeline, sourced revenue, and sourced pipeline. And those are just all roll-up fields that calculates the value of the associated objects. For every contact associated with it, it adds to the count of number of members. For every deal associated with it, if it's sourced, it adds to the sourced pipeline and it closes revenue. And for every influenced deal, it adds to the influence number. So it's a very high level way for us to jump in and look at the immediate impact of a particular event or campaign. For example, we go to RSA, we create a campaign for RSA, and we have different association labels. So all of these say responded because they responded to the ad campaign, they clicked on it. On our RSA campaign event, we have meeting held because we had the opportunity to book a meeting with them, but they also came to the booth, so they get 2 association labels. And HubSpot reporting now enables us to report on association labels so that we can see which campaigns are driving the most responses, which events drove the most meetings. And it gives us a really high level look to see where our influence is being made.
And I don't know if you have it built in here already, but I would imagine then that you could add a property that says the expenditure of the campaign and then calculates your ROI pretty easily based on that.
Exactly. Yeah. So to give a little bit more clarity, like on the back end, we have just a handful of workflows that make this work. So we have 2 additional properties that exist on the contact record: latest campaign touch, primary campaign source. So every time we have a campaign that we're running, what we do is when they interact with it, so in this case, this is all dummy data, they click on an ad and we know the integration is telling us that it's set to conversation ads. We set their latest campaign touch to the name of the campaign, delay, and then create the association based on the matching property being the name. So let me jump in here. So if we look at this, it's going to associate it to the GTM object. It's going to do it based on matching property values, take the latest campaign touch, which we just set, and then maps it to the campaign name. So as long as the campaign name is equal to the campaign touch, they'll be associated with it. And then what happens when, let's say they go through 5 of these before they ever decide to book an MQL, once they've entered marketing qualified lead, it copies the latest campaign touch, which is constantly being overwritten, to the primary campaign source. And that's what gets mapped to the associated deal.
That is a beast of a setup. That is awesome. I'm really excited that you were able to share this with everyone and show it today, because I've created a similar setup using really just deal level properties, but it is less precise than what you've been able to do here. And so I think this is a really great way of, if we take it all A to Z, taking what is both original source data and user entered data, bucketing that, putting it into campaigns with the custom object, and then using the workflows to report all of the deal value against all of it. That is just knockout awesome. So if you're listening to this on Spotify, make sure you check it out on YouTube or LinkedIn and find the video because this is
Chris,
really cool
Chris,
stuff.
how did you come to this? Did you sit on a whiteboard and map it out? Was it trial and error? Yeah, because I know that for me to come to an end result like this, there would have been a lot of pain and broken things between where I started and here.
Yeah. So it very much started with, okay, I'm going to try the innate built-in functionality of HubSpot. Like, again, I think one of the challenges that I face, I think a lot of operations people face, is I'm going to create the most convoluted solution to this pain that I have because I'm super smart and that's going to work.
Story of my life.
Yeah, but the reality is it's not always. Sometimes the simplest answer is the best way. And so I was like, let me deploy this with HubSpot campaigns. Let me trial the HubSpot events. We were just experiencing like the HubSpot events object felt a little bit just like a next level of list uploads, which is fine. But events are very important to us. We wanted to make sure that we were really evaluating the input, the output, and the different activities that we would have. Because one event we might just do booth scans, but at another we might do an offsite event, meetings held in the suite, meetings held here. We want to change, and it totally changes the dynamic of what we're thinking we're getting out of it. And then it was very much, okay, I'm just coming from a place that was using HubSpot and Salesforce, and I really liked the innate functionality and how clean it was to report on HubSpot Salesforce campaigns. How could I potentially recreate that functionality? And so I talked to, like I said, some colleagues who had the experience of migrating HubSpot people from Salesforce to HubSpot. People in Salesforce get attached to that campaign functionality because it is quite good. There's a lot of things that make HubSpot more of an impact tool, but it is difficult to navigate from the data reporting one-to-one. And I had that sense of, okay, a custom object might be the best way to go here. And it was like, okay, what we've done in the past is create two custom objects. You have the campaign members and you have the campaigns, because that's exactly how it is in Salesforce. They're both treated as independent objects. And then you associate them. And that was what really started me on the train of, okay, if we can associate those records, why not just use HubSpot's continuously improving associations functionality to just map existing objects that we're already reporting on, contacts and deals, to one singular custom object. And that was when it started to move to the whiteboarding scenario. Okay, what's the information that I actually need to glean from this for it to be valuable? And it is straight up, how many people interacted with it? What was the revenue that was created? What was the pipeline that was sourced? And then it was, here's the ways that it could scale, but I'm not going to worry about that too much right now. And already it's scaled. Those workflows were created after the HubSpot beta was released. And so we were using a third-party tool. It was fine because we don't do a ton of associations. We were going to have to review, hey, we're going to have to start paying for this functionality. Do we like it enough to scale it? Now it's great that we don't have to do that. But it is, again, it just continuously gets better. And that was the concept that I was trying to work with. Okay, if associations exist, how do I make this work from a reporting mechanism?
Yeah.
I'm quite floored with what you built.
I hear it.
We are going to wrap with a couple of listeners, people who are watching and had some comments come in through LinkedIn. But someone had asked about cookieless features or the deprecation of cookies, which I know we touched on earlier in the episode. I certainly defer to the both of you, probably as having more insight on this than I do. But how does that impact marketing? How does it impact visibility? Is it going to make a difference in this?
Go ahead, Mark.
I just see it as an opportunity, right? I think I see it as an opportunity, for someone to come in. Cookies are not the only thing, right? The national security state has been using metadata that connects different things to build a map of an individual for a long time. We're always downstream of the stuff that they do. I know that sounds a little nefarious, but there are things like, what do they call it? Like a fingerprint that you can associate to a given individual entity online. And so the cookie is not really the be all and end all. And if and when it gets taken away, it'll be replaced by something else that may end up being better. But I don't think it's going to be this massive devastation that has been foretold about.
I agree. I'm coming from a compliance company or a cybersecurity company. Compliance is very important. The reality is EU companies have been able to market in a scenario where cookies are much more heavily restricted and regulated. We will continue to do the same. I think you're absolutely right, Mark, where there is something new will come along. If I had my way and my desire to be a hermit, like nobody would be able to track me ever, but it will continue to happen. And it just comes down to that question of like earlier that I mentioned, like you have to know where to find the data. If things change, where are you going to pivot to find that information that's relevant for your business? It, quite frankly, it emphasizes the importance of self-reported. Are you capturing how did you hear about us today? Are you having the conversations? Are you educating your sales reps to have those conversations to understand like what efforts are working for you? I think like one of the easiest things that can happen to a marketer is to get tripped up on Google Analytics said this, and so we should absolutely change what we're doing. Are you listening to your customer calls? Are you listening to what your product marketers are saying about where the tool is going? There's so many sources of data. Knowing where to look, knowing where to go is ultimately just the biggest pieces as we think about how the tracking ecosystem changes.
Yeah. Just as a side note, I would say that for years and years, I always had Google Analytics open in another window. And I thought that by some magic of osmosis, I would start learning something. And it was just a distraction. And I would just I would get really excited when there were a bunch of people on a new blog post and really down when they weren't. I haven't looked at that and I don't even know how long. So don't make the same mistake I did.
Trend reporting.
I would even venture to say that it's probably a similar question or situation to when Apple updated their privacy settings with their tracking. And I remember everyone was freaking out because we'd no longer be able to track certain user data. And here we are so many years on, and it's still something we contend with, but clearly businesses still stand.
Right.
So I think that more than anything, it's just a testament to the fact that the businesses who get creative and evolve with the times will thrive, and the ones who freak out about the changes in the marketing landscape, they're the ones who are going to struggle.
Yep, that's a great point.
Yeah. Matt, Mark, Chris, I'm going to let the two of you add any final thoughts, and then I'm going to pull up the winner of the swag. The workflow has reached its end. We do have a winner, and I'll share my screen and we'll announce that.
Very exciting. Yeah, Chris, you can go ahead if there's any last bits of information that.
Yeah, I'll just show I appreciate you guys like what we've deployed here. It works for us. I think like the biggest piece that we touched on at the beginning was there are a lot of right ways to do attribution. You have to have the understanding of the process that we just went through to figure out what's right for your organization, what matters to your stakeholders, what matters to you, and figure it out from there. There is no one size fits all.
Yeah. All right, should we do the drum roll?
Let's do it.
Absolutely. We have the workflow here, winner of the Sprocket Pod swag. Again, this was a 45-minute delay. We started the delay earlier in the episode, and a few names have been added throughout based on engagement. So we're going to go and pull up the winner, completed the workflow, and had their property updated. And we've got Matt Baronello. So, Matt, thank you so much for engaging with the comments and being active in the community. Appreciate you listening into the Sprocket Pod. I'll be reaching out and get some Sprocket Pod swag sent your way.
This is a great shtick. We should do it every episode.
Awesome. Yeah, donations are open. The budget is expanding ever always. Thank you very much to everyone for listening in today. If you aren't familiar with the Sprocket Pod, we come to you every week bringing helpful HubSpot content, interviewing Sprocketeers in the HubSpot community. Chris, thank you so much for being on today. If you're not also super familiar, please do check out the HubSpot admin user groups, a HUG hosted Tuesdays at 10 a.m. Central Time with Yana Gloff, Kyle Jepson. They do that every single week, and they're absolutely awesome. You can also check out our past episodes on Spotify and YouTube. They're all uploaded there. And if you're not connected with Chris, Mark, and myself, please make sure you do that. We'll be adding the links to everything in the show notes. And finally, if you're not already in the Sprocketeer Slack channel, please go ahead and you'll find all of us on there. It is the world's largest independent HubSpot user community. So you'll
say
find
that 10 times fast.
I know. You've got 1,500 plus HubSpot admin in there just helping one another and just helping to answer questions, solve problems. So love doing this every week. Thank you for joining the stream and Sprocket on.
Have a great weekend, everybody.
Thanks all.